Getting back into the habit of talking about weird, obscure, and unheard of music here on YouTube, I feel like the next best discussion is going to be on cybergrind. In the simplest terms, cybergrind is basically a combination of grindcore and or gore grind mixed together with electronic music. But if you're a nerd like me and you want a more in-depth description of what cybergrind is, technically it's an umbrella term that encompasses any and all forms of electronic music. Because while grindcore will be the main source in this conversation, as it's really the only style of music that's going to be consistent with all the bands I'll be talking about, when I'm referring to it as an umbrella term, as I stated, electronic music is extremely fluid and very experimental throughout the decades, and this can range from gabber, hardcore techno, breakcore, glitch, noise, synth pop, and industrial, just to name a few. Now, when it comes to the history of cybergrind, pinpointing its origins, what were the first ever bands, and as such, I'm not trying to state this as an excuse, but it's pretty difficult to say which or who did it, mainly because cybergrind, it being so obscure and niche and never really having its own real scene, the information is scattered, and for the most part, I'm going off of, I'll just say, educated speculation on my behalf. To give you an idea of how niche and obscure cybergrind is, the music genre, is that when you search it up on any search engine, whether it be Google, YouTube, etc., is that most of the time what I got in the search results was a game mode called cybergrind for this video game called Ultra Kill, released in the year 2020. So just to give you an idea of how obscure it is, a 5-year-old video game came up more in the search results than this 30-plus-year-old style of music. But to understand the origins of cybergrind, we need to understand the origins of grindcore. I'm sure as most of you know, grindcore is an extreme style of music that emerged in the early 80s. It's a mixture of crust punk, hardcore punk, and other forms of extreme metal. More particularly death metal seems to be one of the main ingredients there. And it stemmed from mostly, I would say, the hardcore punk scene. One of its harbingers that doesn't get brought up enough, I feel like, is Siege, of blending, again, these very fast blast beats mixed together with these hardcore punk riffs and screamed over hardcore vocals that would lay out the blueprints for other bands to follow. As the years progressed into the mid and late 80s, this is where grindcore would become its own unique entity within extreme music. Some noteworthy names that are pioneers for the style of music that I'm sure you all heard of before within this conversation would be Napalm Death, which is considered by many as the first true example of grindcore and is labeled as the first ever grindcore band. Then you got Sore Throat, Fear of God, Blood, Carcass, Terrorizer, and Repulsion. Fast forward a bit into the turn of the decade into the 90s, and from my personal experiences, what I've always noticed about this decade at least is while not everyone in the underground music scene of metal or hardcore punk was open to it, you start noticing a bit that other forms of experimentation and being more open-minded to bringing in electronic music was starting to pop up more in small little pockets. Please note that what I'm about to say next, take with a grain of salt here, because I'm not stating that these bands and artists are in a direct connection to the evolution of cybergrind or the origins of it, but what I'm trying to state here is that this is a clear representation of the mindset and forms of experimentation that were happening in underground music for both metal and punk. Because during this time, groups like Godflesh and Ministry were really starting to blend together metal with other forms of electronic and industrial music. And within the region of punk, this is where Atari Teenage Riot would come forth, blending breakcore and forms of electronic and punk music together, that they called their music digital hardcore. That when you compare digital hardcore to cybergrind, they almost sound like synonyms to each other. So while Godflesh, Ministry, and Atari Teenage Riot may not have any direct correlation to the evolution of cybergrind, what I'm trying to state here is that each and every year during this time, electronic music was starting to seep its way into different other music genres and scenes, and it was only a matter of time until bands within the grindcore scene started adapting it. From what I was able to find, the earliest example of grindcore being fused together with electronic elements would come from this band called O.L.D, which abbreviates to Old Lady Drivers, with their full length from 1993, The Musical Dimensions of Sleestack. For those who are unaware, Old Lady Drivers is a very early grindcore band that formed in the late 80s that isn't active anymore, but what they did release is very tongue-in-cheek, humorous grindcore. I mean, again, they're called Old Lady Drivers. And what this band was, it was fronted by lead vocalist Alan Dubin, which if that name sounds familiar, it's the same Alan Dubin who is the vocalist to that for Khanate. Khanate being one of the most obliterating, heaviest, and just soul-draining drone doom metal bands I can think of. The way they experiment with dark ambience and drone, it's so monotonous, punishing, and nauseating, and having Alan Dubin's vocals that are just so incredibly wretched, vicious, and signature within the extreme music scene, it's really cool to hear his vocals now on something a lot faster. However, when it comes to this full length right here by Old Lady Drivers, that being The Musical Dimensions of Sleestack, this is their third full-length album, and as I stated, it was released in 1993. This album runs for a little over an hour long, which is pretty abnormal considering most grindcore albums are known for being like under 20 minutes at most. And while it is technically grindcore when it comes to the instrumentation of the guitars, drums, and vocals all have all the components that you're used to hearing within it, it puts way more emphasis on experimentation and electronics because all of these weird sounds and textures and ambience are all just bouncing over each other, with all of this wild grindcore being like the driving force of tempo. So it's definitely not for everyone, and if anything, I don't really think they were in the mindset of creating cybergrind, but more of like this experimental art house piece to expand the regions of grindcore overall. Regardless though, if you've never heard of Old Lady Drivers, definitely check out the 2 albums prior to this because it's just really great chaotic grindcore back in the, heyday and golden days of when Earache was releasing some really kick-ass stuff. It's important to keep in mind here that during the early to mid-90s, all of these grindcore bands that were experimenting with electronic music were not calling themselves cybergrind at any such, but they were just experimenting and testing the waters of what they could do with this style of music. That I feel like for today's understanding, with it being so fluid in this umbrella term of what we characterize as cybergrind, we can connect some dots together as such. Because another early example that we can call cybergrind would come from this band called Exit 13, with their album from 1994, Ethos Music. That for the most part, it's really straightforward grindcore with forms of death metal to get into that death grind category, but they would experiment with forms of noise and industrial together, whether it be from their sampling to how they would use pitch-shifted vocals that, again, we can characterize it as a certain kind of like early harbinger to today's understanding of cybergrind. But as you get into the late 90s, this is where more bands are starting to experiment even more with grindcore, and you're starting to notice now that synthesizers, drum machines, and other forms of electronic music is starting to creep its way into grindcore. Take, for example, the Locust with some of their early EPs and full lengths. That the Locust is a widely respected grindcore band when you get into the more experimental region, whether it be in how they write their riffs, to their vocal performance, to especially their electronics, as they would start utilizing synthesizers way more openly with how they would write music, that you'll have all these wild grindcore blast beats screaming and guitar riffs all over the place spiraling out of control. Then it just abruptly transitions to maybe like synthesizers being played within all of that chaos. That the Locust, again, way more rooted within like avant-garde experimental grindcore, but that experimentation would find them into other forms of, again, into cybergrind for this conversation. Another important figure for the early development for this style of music would be the Berserker, which, yeah, there's a bit of bias on my behalf because it's my personal favorite grindcore band, but they're labeled as industrial death grind if you want to get that super technical with it. But when you look at their humble beginnings, it started off as this, I don't know, hardcore techno gabber speedcore project that later on in the late 90s and early 2000s transitioned to what we know it as today. But it never lost sight of its hardcore techno gabber origins and would kind of meld that in with industrial death grind. Because when you look at their first album, they didn't have a drummer, they used a drum machine, which, side note, when it comes to cybergrind, drum machines aren't something you necessarily need. I mean, you can have your own real drummer, but it's something that's definitely welcomed because of the cybergenetic sound it's going for, that having something synthetic and abnormal that can hit like BPMs of like, I don't know, over 300 at a time is welcomed within cybergrind to make it sound futuristic and not human in some sense. And the Berserker technically is one of the first ever like grindcore bands within this conversation to welcome that and allow that when it comes to their debut full-length album. And again, they're kind of like this unannounced harbinger for this style of music. But if we're going to talk about what is considered by many that at least know of this genre as the most important or at least most recognizable cybergrind band, that would easily go to Agoraphobic Nosebleed. Because since day one, with all of their demos and full lengths that they would do after, they would always utilize a combination of grindcore and certain forms of electronic music together, whether it be their drum programming to all the weird sounds and noises you'll hear on albums. They are basically the total package for the understanding of this style of music, so much so that even on the Metal Archives, they're like the only band I've ever come across that has under their genre tag cybergrind, which is quite monumental when you consider how uptight and snobbish the Metal Archives can be when it comes to their inductees, to the genres they label them under. Their discography is pretty large, but I would say if you want the total package of them performing this style of music, that would easily go to their album from 2003, Altered States of America. It consists of 99 songs, most of which being around either 5 to 6 seconds long, containing either samples or noises coming and going at rapid fire, that it's just grindcore essentially with just noises coming and going and just beating you over the head, that if you just want an onslaught of sounds hitting you, definitely check this out. Now, everything I've talked about over the past handful of minutes are either the essentials or bigger names for the history for this genre. If you want even more that's a bit heavier and a bit more of a deep cut for early examples for cybergrind, one I would always recommend and always take the opportunity to talk about would be Catasexual Urge Motivation with their full length from 1996, The Encyclopedia of Serial Killers. This is way more now in the region of gore grind, but they've always utilized either a drum machine or in certain parts with some of their interlude tracks utilizing electronic synthesizers with all of these more like weird electro grind type of percussions and rhythm patterns that it's always such a blast to listen to. Even the band themselves characterizes their style of music as cyber gore, so essentially cyber grind but just rooted in gore grind. Again, if you are a fan of gore grind or just cyber grind, or you just want really just pulverizing, fun, aggressive, nasty music, you gotta listen to Catasexual Urge Motivation. And the other deep cut that I would recommend if you want more of like the prehistoric bands of cybergrind would go to Libido Airbag. These guys were formed in 1995 and they're a German electro porno grind breakcore band. I know it's a lot to talk about with these guys with their genres. It's a more chaotic and sporadic version of Catasexual Urge Motivation in some sense, but just way more tongue-in-cheek. Now, the reason as to why I'm showing you guys a picture of the band and not their album artwork is that literally everything they released would not survive here on YouTube. So keep that in mind if you decide to listen to any of their music online. But I would say in terms of its spirit and how chaotic it is, it's definitely worth a mention here. Getting back on track into the history and timeline for Cybergrind is that when we get into the early 2000s, Cybergrind in some sense has found its own scene, but not in the conventional way. What I mean by this is that there were no labels out there signing any Cybergrind bands, nor were there any kind of like concert tours or festivals having these bands play. If anything, how Cybergrind found its own scene, funny enough, was on the internet, thanks to social media platforms like MySpace. Wow, never thought I'd be talking about this website ever again in my life. But yes, in the mid-2000s, MySpace was the place to be for online social interactions, and it allowed bands and artists to upload their music on their site, which so many of them took advantage of. And you'll notice that during this time of like the mid-2000s, like 2004, 5, and 6, is that a lot of these bands either formed or really started releasing music during this time, because this was the time when MySpace was at its peak. I gotta say here that some of these bands I'm about to be talking about are going to bring back such memories, because I remember I had this friend in high school who was obsessed with Cybergrind. He would always ask me if I knew any other Cybergrind, that he was always talking about it, and believe it or not, one band he would always recommend to me time and time again was Gigantic Brain, when they released their album back in 2004, The Invasion Discography, which it consists of somewhere of a little over 60 songs. So it's again in that vein of like really fast and quick and short grindcore songs, but it's all these wild noises of electronic music going in and out. Again, it's kind of like Agoraphobic Nosebleed, but the transitions aren't as sporadic. It's a bit more focused with what it's trying to do. That if you just want primitive Cybergrind as it kind of gets for the whole MySpace era, Gigantic Brain is a must-know. And another vintage MySpace era Cybergrind I would have to recommend or talk about, We Came With Broken Teeth. They formed in 2005 and it was really short-lived, as they disbanded only 8 years later in 2013. They didn't release much, but what you can hear from them, from what I remember my friend telling me, is that it's the fastest drumming you'll ever hear a band play. Which it's true, the percussions go up to like 350 something BPM, like very fast, and that all has to do with the fact that the percussions are programmed, so it's inhuman, and you don't even hear them. I mean, they're played so fast that it just sounds like one consistent noise other than actual percussions and snare and bass and stuff like that. So I mean, yeah, it's fast, but you can't hear much from it. But regardless, this is just vintage MySpace era Cybergrind for its time, that it kind of resembles elements of deathcore and metalcore to a certain extent, but really dark and kind of primitive at some points. But everything just sounds very cybergenetic. It sounds modified in some sense, whether it be the guitars and vocals and other instrumentation, that it may not be, at least for everyone for today's standards, but if you want vintage as it gets, MySpace era Cybergrind, We Came With Broken Teeth is basically as pure as it's going to get. You'll notice during this particular era of MySpace Cybergrind is that a lot of these bands, whether it be their band name to the musical ideas that they do, are really wild and outlandish. Almost in a sense that they're self-aware that they're on the internet, so they have this certain form of tolerance for lunacy when it comes to their presentation and aesthetics. A few examples that I can give you just from their band name alone that really, perfectly showcases what kind of music you're getting yourself into would be stuff like Princess Army Wedding Combat, Hello Kitty Side Club, Sperm Swamp, Nun Whore Commando 666, and Preschool Tea Party Massacre. But out of all of the wild and outlandish MySpace era Cybergrind bands, the one that always stood out to me that I find myself returning to every once so often because of just how fun it is to listen to would be Cutting Pink with Knives. This was a really short-lived grindcore band based out of the UK, and they blended synth pop with their approach, which I know at face value that sounds like a terrible idea, but they make it work so well, because on their album Oh Wow, yeah, you have these moments of obviously grindcore being played, of all the cliches of the wretched screaming and yelling, blast beats and wild, nauseating guitar riffs just spiraling out of control, but it builds up to these synth pop leads that just oddly work so well, because I think the dynamics of it were just so ungodly simplistic, of just being fast and wild, building up to something unorthodox, and it melds together with the sheer chaos of this band. So definitely give this a chance, because as I stated, it's so fun to listen to. A last minute addition that I personally want to include, that it was releasing music during this time period, but it wasn't a part of the whole like MySpace craze, mainly because this was more of a side project, would be Horker. Now, Horker is a side project to that to Gautier Cyr, which we know of him because of Igor, which has been gaining more and more popularity throughout the years, especially ever since it got signed to Metal Blade Records. And I gotta admit, I'm kind of surprised noticing all of the individuals' fascination with Igor. They're ignoring all of the work that came from Horker, as it's in the same vein of breakcore, glitch, electronics, and all other forms of like experimentation, at least with like Baroque and classical music. But this puts a lot more emphasis with that combination of death metal and grindcore together, that if you want Gautier Cyr's most primitive and brutal forms of experimentation with what he does, you'll find it on Horker. As for the rest of its history from the 2010s to present day, there is still activity going on with certain bands experimenting within this style of music, but really nothing as, I would say, prolific as at least the MySpace era was 10 years prior. A noteworthy name for modern day cybergrind that has been gaining a lot of recognition, but not necessarily for playing cybergrind, and I'll explain in a minute, would be Genghis Tron, that formed in the mid 2000s. They released 2 full-length albums and a plethora of demos and remixes, then would go on hiatus and reform in 2020, release a new album back in 2021 called Dream Weapon. Now, everything prior to their latest full-length album is in vein of experimental grindcore, fusing electronics and other forms of experimentation with grindcore. So in terms of its spirit and overall presentation and sound, it resembles cybergrind. It's just with their latest album, Dream Weapon, this is way more in vein of progressive, electronic, synth metal, I guess you can state, that is completely absent of any form of grindcore whatsoever. And yeah, they've gained a lot of recognition now, mainly because it got signed them to Relapse Records, surprisingly. But it's interesting to note here that a band that started playing this really niche, obscure style of music would gain any form of recognition, even if they had to change their style. And I feel like because of that, bands may go into their back catalog and rediscover or hear for the first time ever what cybergrind was all about. A much newer name for cybergrind would be Blind Equation, that formed only back in 2021, and they've already released a handful of albums. And what's interesting about this is, obviously in the style of cybergrind, obviously you have grindcore, but it mixes together forms of electronic music such as chiptune and Nintendo core, which I'll try to the best of my ability to describe what that is. It's kind of like a mixture of music really embedded within video games, of like 16 and 18-bit video game music, only now with Nintendo core it has more of this emphasis on hardcore. It's a bit more abrasive, more upbeat, that again you would find a bit of nostalgia with, at least if you're a millennial like myself. Hence why I feel like it's found somewhat of this small following with individuals who grew up playing 16-bit video games. And Blind Equation is trying to meld that all together with this form of cybergrind. But I will say what makes them a bit more of a standout here is the vocal performance, and overall just presentation and songwriting is a lot more emotive than anything else that I've talked about thus far. And while this is definitely not for everyone, as it's really experimental and blending forms that you don't really find in any kind of form of extreme music, I do feel like for people who are looking to be a bit more adventurous and look for more emotive music, this might be right up your alley. And the last newer band worth mentioning here would be Zombie Shark, all one word in capital letters, that this project is a huge melting pot of any form of electronic music you can think of being melded together with grindcore. That I would say in terms of production value, surprisingly this is the best mixed and mastered out of anything I've heard within this style of music, as it's very professionally done. It's just there is going to be a lot hitting you, because transitions are going to happen like every 10 seconds almost. It's going to feel like it's always changing. There's always going to be a new subgenre of electronic music fusing and then falling apart and melding into something new all the time. There's just a lot that is going to happen, and it can be a bit overbearing at times just for any extreme music fan, because you're not going to find anything to latch on to. But if you just want a clusterfuck, if you want just Cybergrind to have this, mentality of just going off the rails, crashing, and then getting back on to do it all over again in some different form, Zombie Shark really tries to, give you a thrill ride, I would say, that is just as emotive as Blind Equation, just way more eviscerating. And a last minute addition that I want to include for more newer Cybergrind bands that have formed at least over the past decade would be this project called Chop, 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 Chop. It's Chop stated 7 times. And this is nothing groundbreaking or something you haven't heard of before. If anything, it's really straightforward, primitive grindcore that's super aggressive and obnoxious. It's just the electronic portions are just meant to add to the chaos. There's nothing fancy, nothing that experimental, but super, super vicious. And for the adrenaline junkie that just wants primitive Cybergrind, definitely check out this project. In conclusion, Cybergrind is always going to be this niche, underground, internet-only type of style of music. Sure, there may be some projects that, latch out a little bit and might even have a bit of success, but that's few and far between. I really do feel like this was meant primarily for the people on the internet looking for niche, wild things. But I do feel like Cybergrind is always going to evolve and exist, mainly because as long as grindcore exists, there's always going to be someone that wants to experiment and test the waters. And with electronic music being just so fluid and experimental as it is, there's always going to be someone that wants to take that experimentation and apply it to all different forms of music, grindcore being one of them. So as long as grindcore exists and electronic music continues to experiment and evolve, there's always going to be someone making some wild, wacky stuff with Cybergrind. And that'll do it for this video, guys. Like always, everything I talked about will be linked below down in the description. Really curious to know what you think of Cybergrind and what other projects or bands stand out to you within this style of music. And like always, guys, make sure you guys drink plenty of water to stay hydrated, and have a great day.